is so great to be with you, and I want to tell you a story of a man who joined a monastery. He took a vow of silence, something I can hardly even fathom being able to do, but he took a vow of silence nonetheless. No comments there, family. And every 7 years, he was allowed to say 2 words. So every day he would get up, he would be in service most of the day, and then after service, he would be in study, and then he would go to sleep and wake up and do that every 365 days a year. He would do that. Service, study, service, study. At the end of 7 years, he was allowed 2 words as he came before the elders of the monastery. The elders invited him into the room, and he sat down, and they said, "You were allowed to share 2 words. The floor is yours." He thought for a moment. He said, "Cold floors." They nodded, and he walked out of the room. 7 more years go by. Service, study, service, study, service, study. Every day, 365 days a year, 7 years in a row, they bring him back in. "You have 2 words that you're allowed to speak. The floor is yours." He thought for a moment. He said, "Bad food." They nodded, and he left. Service, study, service, study. 7 more years go by, and he comes back before them. And they said, "You are allowed to say 2 words. The floor is yours." To which he retorted, "I quit." The lead elder stood up. He said, "I figured as much. All you've done is complain ever since you got here." Yeah. Our words are powerful, aren't they? Some of you will be with family this week for Thanksgiving, if people allow that. But as you gather, wherever you are, as you're gathering, people will be honking different things from the line. And as you gather, you will have the opportunity to speak into these moments as well. And today, as we dive into this 4th and final week of this incredible series that has been really tough on me, what's hard about preaching, friends, what some of you, most of you would not understand, is that when you preach a lot, your words get used a lot. And sometimes they even get used by your own family. And it's much easier sometimes to share these words than it is to live by these words. Amen? In each of our lives. It's one thing to say things. It's another thing to live by the things that we say. It's one thing to say and understand the power of the tongue. It's another thing to make sure that we use the power of the tongue in ways that are constructive and not destructive. In this 4-week series in the power of the tongue, we've been on a journey together through the book of Proverbs. And today is certainly no exception. We're going to wrap up in the 25th chapter of Proverbs with a message entitled, "A Timely Tongue." And today, as we open up, I have 2 invitations for you. The first is this: wherever you are worshiping with us from, here in the room, or you who are worshiping with us online, whatever city, state with whom you worship with us from. And if you're outside the U.S., please list your country as well. But if you'll list the city and state where you're worshiping with us and who's worshiping with you online, we'd love to just celebrate that with you if you're on Facebook or YouTube worshiping with us today. The second is this: I want to invite you to do something maybe others will read and maybe they won't. Maybe it's just something you offer to God as you type this in there. What are 2 phrases, not 2 words like cold floors or bad food or I quit, but what are 2 phrases that you most love to hear or long to hear from others? I asked that question of the staff this week and of my family, and as I did, there were some great responses. Responses we've been talking about over these last weeks. "I love you. I'm proud of you. You're doing a good job. Thank you. I'm glad you're mine. Please forgive me. I forgive you." But my favorite came from our communications director, who said his phrase was "free pizza in the break room." Very profound. Very profound. Today we're going to read out of Proverbs 25, verses 11 through 15. And in reverence for God's most precious and holy word, I'm going to invite you to stand today. At the end of the reading, I'll turn to you and say, "This is the word of God for the people of God," and you'll respond, but a lot louder than that. Proverbs 25, beginning with verse 11. "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Like a gold ring or an ornament of gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. Like The cold of snow in time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him. He refreshes the soul of his masters. Like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of a gift he does not give. With patience, a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. This is the word of God for the people of God. You may be seated. This series reminds me of a new preacher who started in ministry many years ago, and he got up to preach, and on his very first Sunday, straight out of seminary, he brought the one sermon he had prepared into his brand new church, and he preached it with all he had, and he went to the back of the little country church, and he stood at the back door and greeted people as they walked out, and lots of way to go. That was a great message, preacher. Thank you so much for your faithful work with the word and bringing it to us today. And the next week, he got up to preach, and he preached the exact same sermon. And once again, he went to the back of the church, and he stood at the door, and he shook every hand as they walked out. And they said, wow, that was a great message, preacher. Thank you. I heard some things this week I didn't catch last week. Thank you for that. That was really great, I guess. And the next week, he got up to preach, and guess what? Same sermon. Same sermon. And he went to the back, and finally some people huddled over in the corner as they were all filing out, and the SPRC, the Staff Parish Relations Chair, kind of held back at the end and waited for everyone else to file out of the little country church. And he went up to him and said, preacher, he said, look, I know you're young, I know you're learning, I know you're growing, I know you're trying to bring a faithful word to us. He said, but the first week it was great. The second week, it had some insight still that I missed that first week, but it's the third week. When are we going to get, another sermon? The young preacher looked right at him and said, well, as soon as you act on the first one. This message series today, on a timely word, a timely tongue, it could be said that we could do this message every Sunday for the rest of our lives because of the need of us to act on that which we know. I want to encourage you today that this message, that it should land deep inside of us. And the main idea of this message today is that we need a word that is the right time, the right place, in the right way. There are three parts to this message. And the first one is what every good real estate agent knows. The key to a good word, a timely word, is location, location, location. Proverbs 25:11-13 says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Like a gold ring or an ornament of gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. Like the cold of snow in the time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him. He refreshes the soul of his masters. The shuttle program was once grounded for several weeks due to cracks in a little bitty fuel line. We're reminded when I was a young boy in school of a terrible episode that happened when a tiny rubber O-ring about 3/10 of an inch wide, to look at it all by itself was nothing. It was literally, it would not impress anyone to see a tiny little O-ring. And yet 35 years ago, this coming January 28th, 2 of those rings were placed in the aft field joint of the solid rocket booster to stop gases from escaping. Whether it was the unusually cold weather, a contaminant introduced in the design, the zinc putty used on them, or any number of potential compression problems, or even human error during manufacturing. These 2 tiny miniature O-rings failed. They failed to do what they were designed to do. And the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded before a watching world. I was watching it myself, sitting in class on that January day. It's 73 seconds into her flight, claiming the lives of all 7 crew members on board. You see, it's the little things. It's the little things that can bring life or can cause great destruction. It's the little things. It's literally as small as tiny viruses the size of a pinhead. As small as heart valves no larger than a man's thumbnail. As single votes in an election. As ill-chosen words from a loved one. Little things have tremendous power. A tiny phrase in the right place can be the hinge upon which the doors of life open. Hear me. A tiny phrase in the right place can be the hinge upon which the doors of life open to another. You speaking the right thing at the right time in the right way to the right person can change everything. You see, friends, affirmation costs us nothing. It doesn't cost us a thing, but it can mean everything in the life of another. Michel de Montaigne said, "The word is half his that speaks and half his that hears." As you offer words of affirmation this day, this week, this year in your life, I want you not only to consider you who speak, but the one who hears them. What is it they need to hear from you in the right season? Whenever I do premarital counseling, one of the things that always comes out is when we do the 5 love languages, when we walk through words of affirmation, quality time, physical touch, acts of service, and gifts, inevitably, at least one of the two, and usually often both, words of affirmation is high on the list. That we speak those words of affirmation to each other, to build each other up, to know our value and worth to another, to feel completely, abundantly loved. Words of affirmation are key. And making sure we put them in the right time and the right place is very important. But there's a second piece that's incredibly important in today's message. In this timely tongue message that we're bringing here. Proverbs 25:14 says it this way: "Like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of a gift he does not give." And I would submit to you that the second part is not only that we have location with those words, but that our words are dependable. That we have a dependable word. When the clouds come in and when the winds pick up, what we assume is coming is rain. And there have been many times where our house is kind of up on the hill here behind the church. And there are times that we can see the clouds and we can feel the wind and we can feel the drop in barometric pressure and we can feel things cooling down. But the rain never quite makes it there. There are people that are desperate for the rain to get there from you. That are desperate to hear a word at the right moment in the right way spoken. Sometimes it's not that we don't understand what needs to be spoken. It's more about a difficulty of actually doing it. I've shared before that my grandfather had an aneurysm when he was about 80 years old. The first 80 years of his life, almost no one in the family, myself and my generation, my mother and her generation with her siblings, and even his wife, my grandfather almost never said, "I love you, I'm sorry, I'm grateful for you, I'm proud of you, I'm glad you're mine." Almost never said any of those things. But the last 10 years of his life, in that season, I wouldn't give anything for that season, because every time I was around him, I heard it. I heard those words of life being spoken. Proverbs 15:23 says it this way: "A word spoken in season, how good it is." In this season, I would submit to you that this is a season in which the goodness of God could come into the lives of others and could come into your life because of offering a dependable word with children, with grandchildren, and even with great-grandchildren. And not only that, but for those of you who are younger, to speak those words to parents, to grandparents, and to great-grandparents. That we would, how good it is when that word is spoken in season. It's important to get the right location. It's important to have a dependable and timely word. But let's be clear, there are going to be times where conflict comes and the conflict is great. This very week, some of you will sit at tables with people who voted differently, who think differently, who act differently, who have different opinions. And this is the final word I want to say to you about today's message. Not only that it would be about location and the right place and time to speak, and then about dependability, that people can count on your words being dependable and trustworthy and true. But also that it would be a word that is winsome. Proverbs 25:15 says it this way: "With patience a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone." This week it was amazing. Cindy and I had gotten into a huge disagreement. she just wouldn't agree with me. I don't know what the problem was. That's a joke, by the way. That's a joke. We got into this huge disagreement, and finally she turned to me and she said, don't you realize what's going on? I said, what are you talking about? She said, this is not about this issue. Satan doesn't want these power of the tongue words to go out. He wants to distract you and us from getting this message out. Friends, there's an enemy that doesn't like what God is doing in your life. There's an enemy that doesn't want you to speak these words of life. There's an enemy who wants to distract you and detract you and just knock you off course. I'm so convinced that part of this series we could do, literally, we could just hit reboot and every month just start and do this series again. Because some of us are so desperate for the words of life to be spoken, and some of us are so desperate to have the words of death taken out of our vocabulary. When it comes to this winsome word, let me just give you some pieces of advice that I've been studying this week. We need first to listen to hear and not just to respond. Have you ever experienced this where you're speaking and you're talking to someone else and you can see the wheels turning and they're just waiting for you to hush long enough so they can jump back in and give you their counterpoint? They don't want to give you a piece of their heart. They just want to give you a piece of their mind. I don't want to hear what you have to say. I just want to stomp on whatever it is you just said. We are called to listen to hear and not just to respond. I believe it was Aristotle who said, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Just because you're listening to someone else doesn't mean you're agreeing with what they're saying. You listen to hear. You listen to dialogue. You listen to hear their heart and how they came to their conclusion. There's a difference between resolution and resolving to love a person above an issue. There's a difference between agreeing on everything. We don't have to agree on everything to love one another. When we agree to disagree, we honor the relationship above trying to necessarily change a person. You don't have to agree on everything to agree to love each other. I love passing cars on the interstate or around town that say house divided, and there'll be an Alabama and an Auburn tag, or there'll be people that I know that have a Republican and a Democrat in the same house. There'll be people that I love that I enjoy seeing the emotional maturity to be able to hold two different ideas at the same time and see the value in both and see the difficulty in each. You see, we can disagree without being disagreeable. You can be right and still be a jerk. You can be wrong and still be kind. I wish more people would heed the advice I was reading this week. Steve Marabala, I'm not even sure I'm saying his name right, but he said, world, please listen, world. The volume of your voice does not increase the validity of your argument. Have you ever met someone that they just say the same thing over and louder and louder and louder, and they're not changing anything about what they're saying? They're just saying the same, like, you're like, I'm not deaf, I just disagree. Oh, it just needs to be like this. I'm not deaf, I just disagree. I love words from 200 years ago from Frank A. Clark, who is a lawyer and politician born in the late 1800s, who said, we find comfort among those who agree with us, and we find growth among those who don't. Hear that again. We find comfort. We like to be around people who just agree with us, but we find growth by being in the midst of people who don't. I hope that you haven't surrounded yourself with only people who agree with you, or even more so, I hope that you haven't kicked people out of your life with whom you disagree. As you prepare to spend time with your family this Thanksgiving, this Advent, and this Christmas season, I want to invite you to think before you speak. I can't think of a more important week to remind you of this acronym, THINK. This acronym that could change everything. And there's one salient thing I want to say at the end of this that really encapsulates the whole of today's message. I want to underscore when you're going to say something to someone else, I want you to ask 5 questions on the acronym THINK. Is it true? Is what I'm going to say, is it true? Is it based in truth? Is it not just based on a true story, but is it true? Does it ring true? The second is it helpful? Is this just superfluous data that I'm giving, or is this something that's helpful to the situation we're in? Is it helpful to our relationship? Is it helpful to me valuing you and you valuing me? Is it helpful not just that we have to agree on everything, but that we can disagree and not be disagreeable? Is it inspiring? Is it inspiring other people to be a better person, a better self, a more loving and gracious, kind person in the world? Is it inspiring me on towards love and good deeds? THIN. Is it necessary? Does this need to be spoken, or is this something that's better left unsaid? It could be true, and it could be helpful, and it could be inspiring, but it just might not be the right time. It might not be necessary to be spoken here. And finally, the K, is it kind? Is it kind? The rhetoric in our world right now is so visceral and so angry and so defiant and so headbutting. Is it kind? As you sit around the table with your family this year, hear me, if the answer to any of those, if it's not true, if it's not helpful, if it's not inspiring, if it's not necessary, and if it's not kind, if the answer to any of those is no, then the statement you're about to make probably needs to be hushed. But hear me, I'm also really convinced that if it is true and helpful and inspiring and necessary and kind, it needs to be rushed. It needs to be stated. Don't wait to speak those words of I love you and I'm sorry and I forgive you and please forgive me and I believe in you and you're valuable and you're enough and I'm proud of you and oh, you're doing great things. And if it's those kinds of words of life, it needs to be rushed. Don't hold it back. There are people who have been destroyed by the words of death being spoken over them over and over and over and over. And there are people who have been starved by the words of life never being uttered. Friends, if we would get this, it could change your Thanksgiving. It could change your time around the table. It could change our world.